Call First. Written by Ramsey Campbell. Read by Scott MacDonald. It was the other porters who made Ned determined to know who answered the phone in the old man's house. Not that he hadn't wanted to know before. He'd felt it was his right, almost as soon as the whole thing had begun months ago. He'd been sitting behind his desk in the library entrance, waiting for someone to try to take a bag into the library so he could shout after them that they couldn't, when the reference librarian ushered the old man up to Ned's desk and said, "Let this gentleman use your phone." Maybe he hadn't meant every time the old man came to the library, but then he should have said so. The old man used to talk to the librarian and tell him things about books even he didn't know, which was why he let him phone. All Ned could do was feel resentful. People weren't supposed to use his phone, and even he wasn't allowed to phone outside the building. And it wasn't as if the old man's calls were interesting. Ned wouldn't have minded if they'd been worth hearing. "I'm coming home now." That was all he ever said. Then he'd put down the receiver and hurry away. It was the way he said it that made Ned wonder. There was no feeling behind the words. They sounded as if he were saying them only because he had to, perhaps wishing he needn't. Ned knew people talked like that. His parents did in church and most of the time at home. He wondered if the old man was calling his wife because he wore a ring on his wedding finger, although in the claw where a stone should be was what looked like a piece of yellow fingernail. But Ned didn't think it could be his wife. Each day the old man came, he left the library at the same time, so why would he bother to phone? Then there was the way the old man looked at Ned when he phoned, as if he didn't matter and couldn't understand, the way most of the porters looked at him. That was the look that swelled up inside Ned one day. It made him persuade one of the other porters to take charge of his desk while Ned waited to listen in on the old man's call. The girl who always smiled at Ned was on the switchboard, and they listened together. They heard the phone in the house ringing, then lifted, and the old man's call and his receiver going down. Nothing else, not even breathing apart from the old man's. "Who do you think it is?" the girl said. But Ned thought she'd laugh if he said he didn't know. He shrugged extravagantly and left. Now he was determined. The next time the old man came to the library, Ned phoned his house, having read what the old man dialed. When the ringing began, its pulse sounded deliberately slow, and Ned felt the pumping of his blood rushing ahead. 7 trills, and the phone in the house opened with a violent click. Ned held his breath, but all he could hear was his blood thumping in his ears. "Hello?" he said, and after a silence, clearing his throat, "Hello." Perhaps it was one of those answering machines people in films used in the office. He felt foolish and uneasy, greeting the wide, silent metal ear, and put down the receiver. He was in bed and falling asleep before he wondered why the old man should tell an answering machine that he was coming home. The following day, in the bar where all the porters went at lunchtime, Ned told them about the silently listening phone. "He's weird, that old man," he said. But now the others had finished joking with him. They no longer seemed interested, and he had to make a grab for the conversation. "He reads weird books," he said, "all about witches and magic. Real ones, not stories." "Now tell us something we didn't know," someone said, and the conversation turned its back on Ned. His attention began to wander. He lost his hold on what was being said. He had to smile and nod as usual when they looked at him, and he was thinking, "They're looking at me like the old man does. I'll show them. I'll go in his house and see who's there. Maybe I'll take something that'll show I've been there. Then they'll have to listen. But next day at lunchtime, when he arrived at the address he'd seen on the old man's library card, Ned felt more like knocking at the front door and running away. The house was menacingly big, the end house of a street whose other windows were brightly bricked up. Exposed foundations, like broken teeth, protruded from the mud that surrounded the street, while the mud was walled in by a 5-story crescent of flats that looked as if it had been designed in sections to be fitted together by a 2-year-old. Ned tried to keep the house between him and the flats, even though they were hundreds of yards away as he peered in the windows. All he could see through the grimy front window was bare floorboards. When he coaxed himself to look through the side window, the same. He dreaded being caught by the old man, even though he'd seen him sitting behind a pile of books 10 minutes ago. It had taken Ned that long to walk here. The old man couldn't walk so fast, and there wasn't a bus he could catch. At last, he dodged round the back and peered into the kitchen. A few plates in the sink, some tins of food, an old cooker. Nobody to be seen. He returned to the front, wondering what to do. Maybe he'd knock after all. He took hold of the bar of the knocker, trying to think what he'd say, and the door opened. The hall leading back to the kitchen was long and dim. Ned stood shuffling indecisively on the step. He would have to decide soon, for his lunch hour was dwindling. It was like one of the empty houses he'd used to play in with the other children, daring each other to go up the tottering stairs. Even the things in the kitchen didn't make it seem lived in. He'd show them all. He went in, acknowledging a vague idea that the old man's companion was out. He closed the door to hear if they returned. On his right was the front room. On his left, past the stairs and the phone, another of the bare rooms he'd seen. He tiptoed upstairs. The stairs creaked and swayed a little, perhaps unused to anyone of Ned's weight. He reached the landing, breathing heavily, feeling dust chafe in his throat. Stairs led up to a closed attic door, but he looked in the rooms off the landing. 2 of the doors, which he opened stealthily, showed him nothing but boards and flurries of floating dust. The landing in front of the third looked cleaner, as if the door were often open. He pulled it towards him, holding it up all the way so it didn't scrape the floor, and went in. Most of it didn't seem to make sense. There was a single bed with faded sheets. Against the walls were tables and piles of old books. Even some of the books looked disused. There were black candles and racks of small cardboard boxes. On one of the tables lay a single book. Ned padded across the fragments of carpet and opened the book in a thin path of sunlight through the shutters. Inside the sagging covers was a page which Ned slowly realized had been ripped from the Bible. It was the story of Lazarus. Scribbles that might be letters filled the margins, and at the bottom of the page, P 491. Suddenly inspired, Ned turned to that page in the book. It showed a drawing of a corpse sitting up in his coffin. But the book was all in the language they sometimes used in church, Latin. He thought of asking one of the librarians what it meant. Then he remembered that he needed proof he'd been in the house. He stuffed the page from the Bible into his pocket. As he crept swiftly downstairs, something was troubling him. He reached the hall and thought he knew what it was. He still didn't know who lived in the house with the old man. If they lived in the back, perhaps there would be signs in the kitchen. Though, if it was his wife, Ned thought as he hurried down the hall, she couldn't be like Ned's mother, who would never have left torn strips of wallpaper hanging at shoulder height from both walls. He'd reached the kitchen door when he realized what had been bothering him. When he'd emerged from the bedroom, the attic door had been open. He looked back involuntarily and saw a woman walking away from him down the hall. He was behind the closed kitchen door before he had time to feel fear. That came only when he saw that the back door was nailed rustily shut. Then he controlled himself. She was only a woman. She couldn't do much if she found him. He opened the door minutely. The hall was empty. Halfway down the hall, he had to slip into the side room, heart punching his chest, for she'd appeared again from between the stairs and the front door. He felt the beginnings of anger and recklessness, and they grew faster when he opened the door and had to flinch back as he saw her hand passing. The fingers looked famished, the color of old lard, with long, yellow, cracked nails. There was no nail on her wedding finger, which wore a plain ring. She was returning from the direction of the kitchen, which was why Ned hadn't expected her. Through the opening of the door, he heard her padding upstairs. She sounded barefoot. He waited until he couldn't hear her, then edged out into the hall. The door began to swing open behind him with a faint creak, and he drew it stealthily closed. He paced towards the front door. If he hadn't seen her shadow creeping down the stairs, he would have come face to face with her. He'd retreated to the kitchen and was near to panic when he realized she knew he was in the house. She was playing a game with him. At once he was furious. She was only an old woman. Her body beneath the long white dress was sure to be as thin as her hands. She could only shout when she saw him. She couldn't stop him leaving. In a minute, he'd be late for work. He threw open the kitchen door and swaggered down the hall. The sight of her lifting the phone receiver broke his stride for a moment. Perhaps she was phoning the police. He hadn't done anything. She could have her Bible page back, but she laid the receiver beside the phone. Why? Was she making sure the old man couldn't ring? As she unbent from stooping to the phone, she grasped two uprights of the banisters to support herself. They gave a loud, splintering creak and bent together. Ned halted, confused. He was still struggling to react when she turned towards him, and he saw her face. Part of it was still on the bone. He didn't back away until she began to advance on him, her nails tearing new strips from both walls. All he could see was her eyes, unsupported by flesh. His mind was backing away faster than he was, but it had come up against a terrible insight. He even knew why she'd made sure the old man couldn't interrupt until she'd finished. His calls weren't like speaking to an answering machine at all. They were exactly like switching off a burglar alarm. You've been listening to Call First, written by Ramsey Campbell, read by Scott McDonald. Thank you for listening.